Thank you for being here. My name is Matt Prewitt. It's great to see you all. I'm the president of RadicalxChange Foundation, which is a nonprofit that works on institutional innovation and thinks about the future of the sort of fundamental institutions of democracy, including markets and voting, and as we'll talk about now, courts and law and jurisprudence. And so I'm very privileged today to be joined by Patryk Wachowiec and Morshed Mannan. Patryk is an expert in the rule of law and is the CEO of Coder Institute, which is doing wonderful work in thinking about sort of the future of the rule of law in Poland, which we'll hear more about today. And Morshed Mannan is an expert in blockchain governance, an expert in thinking about the connection between legality and legitimacy and a range of new institutions, including blockchain and the governance of all sorts of new digital networks. So thank you both for being here today, and would love to start this off by perhaps just a couple minutes about each of your background and your work, and then we can jump in with a provocation about the rule of law and new institutions. So we'll start with Patryk.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Patryk Wachowiec. I'm a legal analyst at the Civic Development Forum, a leading NGO in Poland dealing both with economic freedom, which is quite relevant here, I think, and the rule of law. I am responsible for the rule of law branch. In our work, we try to solve the problem. Let's be honest, the problem with Poland's rule of law and the ongoing crisis, which we observe, which spills over the whole European Union, and which creates a massive problems with legitimacy of courts and the parliament as well. So what we do, we suggest some solutions how to get out of the crisis, especially when it comes to judicial nominations, because this is the very institution that has been spoiled since late 2015. And of course, in a much more broader context, how to restore the democratic legitimacy of courts, how to bring the public trust in the judiciary, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of work to do. We cooperate with many NGOs, with European institutions as well, individual experts of constitutional law, legal philosophy as well. But the process of finding solutions is still ongoing as the crisis unfolds. So we have plenty of work to do. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, and Morshed, I wonder if you can sort of frame your work a little bit.
Yes, of course. Thank you, Matt, and the others at RadicalxChange for inviting me today to come and speak to you a bit about part of what the research that I'm currently doing. By way of background, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the European University Institute in Florence, and I am part of the Blockchain Gov research project funded by the European Research Council. During the course of my PhD, before I did research on the emergence of democratic firms in the platform economy, so looking at platform cooperatives, trusts that are bottom-up and democratically controlled, as well as decentralized autonomous organizations, a topic that I overheard in a previous panel, so I won't go into a lot of detail about. And after completing that PhD, I joined this Blockchain Gov project where, among other things, we apply legal and political theory to understand the development and growth of blockchain governance. And so we look at, among other things, the potential clash between what some have called the rule of code and the rule of law. And that's among one of the topics that I hope we'll get to discuss today. And we also are looking at questions like the nature of trust or trustlessness, as some claim, in blockchain systems, as well as the legitimacy of blockchain governance.
So I hope that we will steer the conversation eventually towards the sort of the interaction between the legal order and these new technologies that you're thinking about the governance of. But I think it might make sense to start off with a little bit of discussion around the rule of law in Poland or in the European Union more broadly. What are the threats to it, and how are you thinking about addressing those problems, Patryk?
Well, thanks for that question, Matt. Well, the problem started about 12 years ago when the current government took the power in Hungary, and started to get rid of many institutions that secure democracy and the rule of law. And this process has spilled over many other countries, including Poland, which according to VIDEM Institute, which measures the level of democracy, was the country that faced the most authoritarian decline in the decade in the world. So this is quite serious. And of course, we observe at the European level, in the European institutions, that this problem is not correctly addressed, so to speak. There are tendencies to politicize the solutions about how to deal with these issues in Poland, in Hungary, but also in Malta, in Romania as well, in Bulgaria, where we observe a huge percentage of corruption, for example. But the Poland specificity, what's specific in Poland is that, well, the ruling majority decided to capture the judiciary by by packing the Constitutional Tribunal, the Supreme Court, by changing the way in which judges are nominated or appointed, by introducing new special procedures to deal with final judgments, to create new chambers tasked with disciplining judges, to merge the office of the Minister of Justice and the Prosecutor General, and empowering this institution with huge powers over individual prosecutors. So in fact, many branches of, broadly speaking, justice system has already been captured, but there are of course responses mainly from European courts. The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and the Court of Justice of the European Union in Luxembourg. Well, in a recent set of judgments from Strasbourg as well as from Luxembourg, these courts clearly decided that the system of judicial appointments in Poland is corrupted, has been captured by the judiciary, and it is per se incompatible with the right to fair trial according to European conventions. However, we see retaliatory measures from the Polish side. The captured Constitutional Tribunal has declared that the decisions of European courts are unconstitutional, are null and void, despite the fact that we still are a member of these institutions. There are attempts to put legislation that will invalid European judgments as well. So we see a huge clash between both of these issues. And the main issue, I think, in Poland is the composition of the body responsible for judicial nominations, which is the National Council of the Judiciary. 5 years ago, the current government has changed the manner of appointment of a huge part of this body. and 15 out of 25 members who are judges are now elected by parliament, not by judges themselves. So this is the main problem. The process of appointing judges has been politicized. The political powers have gained a huge influence on who can be a judge, and as a consequence, how he or she can can decide cases, especially politically sensitive cases. So this is how the scene looks like as of today.
So I wonder if you could comment on a big question, which is that there's at least I don't think it is a real contradiction, but there's an apparent contradiction in a lot of these discussions where we're talking about democratizing lots of institutions. We're talking about sort of adding democracy to the functioning of a lot of basic institutions. But then when we talk about judiciary and the rule of law, often the problem that we're worried about is precisely interference between democracy and that system. So for example, there's the practice of elections of judges is broadly criticized. The idea of sort of popular pressure on judges is often precisely the problem that we're trying to guard against when we think about the integrity of the judiciary. So I wonder if you could comment briefly on how you, and then of course, from an American perspective, I would add that there's a multi-decade conversation about the sort of counter-majoritarian role of the courts within the system. And I wonder if you could comment on that a little bit, how you see the relationship between the authority of legal systems and the authority of democracy.
Well, to begin with, I see little contradiction between both of these issues. First, of course, the judiciary is presented as the least democratically legitimized branch of power. To me, it is quite different, because take for example constitutional review and the very top level of the judiciary, upholding the constitution, striking down legislation enacted by parliament is also a democratic act, because the legitimacy, the source of legitimacy of a constitutional court and constitutional review is the constitution itself, which was enacted democratically, was deliberated during when it was drafted, and so on and so forth. But also what is inherent in judicial reasoning is democratic, I think, because compare it to how parliaments take decisions. Majority, the minority is overlooked, has lost the vote, and so on and so forth. But if we look at the courts, especially constitutional or supreme courts, judges are professionals. The hearing is open to public, it's transparent. Both sides can elaborate their arguments before the court. So when judges need to decide this case, they take into consideration all those arguments. Those presented by the majority, those posed by minorities who stood up before this court. So this is also, I think, democratic. And the third argument, I think, is that democracy is not only the will of majority, and upholding democracy by courts, especially constitutional courts, means also promoting democratically inherent values such as freedom, equality, tolerance, and so on and so forth. And in striking down legislation, well, the courts are in fact upholding democratic principles, I think. So this is my response to your question.
It's a beautiful point. In particular, I'd like to underline and appreciate the point you made about the democratic nature of judicial reasoning. So I think in particular the sort of the disclosure of, the decision that a court makes, may or may not be good, you may or may not agree with it, but there's something about, I think, the disclosure of reasoning that is sort of open to scrutiny by anyone in a profoundly democratic way, which is different from, for example, Parliament, which doesn't need to disclose its reasoning. It can say, this is what my constituents want and this is what we're doing, right? And so there's a very interesting sort of inversion there, yeah, different aspects of the democratic process. And I think that transitions nicely to the question of, for Morshed. So I would love to hear a little bit about a little bit more about your work on the relationship between legality and the governance of digital networks. You can comment on that directly, or another aspect that might be nice to bring in here is that, for example, Audrey Tang in Taiwan has emphasized the sort of point that one of the most sort of productive ways of improving the functioning of democratic institutions is in a way to build institutions that are outside of them and that maybe adhere to deep democratic values better than the official institutions do, and therefore sort of place a kind of a soft pressure on formal institutions to do better and adhere to their own values. And I think that in some ways, at least, we might imagine governance of digital networks or of platforms performing that kind of a role. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts and your work.
Thank you, Matt. Those are both really interesting questions. So I'll take the first one. Obviously, when we're talking about digital networks, we can draw a distinction, as is often done nowadays, between more traditional platform operators and those sort of Web3 networks that we're now seeing. And they raise different questions even in the context of a rule of law discussion. So the reason for this is partly about how easy it is to bring them within the, let's say, the bounds of the rule of law. So if we take the traditional platform operator, we can see that, well, they're registered somewhere and they have that as their home jurisdiction, and then they might have subsidiaries in many other parts of the world. And in a sense, even if they claim to be a global network, they claim to have this sort of borderless quality, not only are they very much embedded in a particular legal context and a particular rule of law context, but that they also in some cases are exporting certain values as well. So we see this, of course, being discussed a lot in the context of social media networks, where the idea is that not only are they subject to certain rules about how they approach things like content moderation, but they themselves are promoting certain ideas about what freedom of speech are based on where they are from. And we see that as the hegemony of particular social media networks are being challenged with competitor social media networks emerging in other parts of the world. I won't go into a lot of names here, but you know who I'm talking about probably. You end up having maybe competing visions of what, for instance, freedom of speech looks like online. So that's with respect to, let's say, the rule of law as applying to traditional online platforms. But interestingly, when we're still talking about these platforms, we can see that they are able to, and this is not a given, but some have claimed that they are able to operate their own fiefdoms. endogenously. So there's one aspect which is sort of the exogenous influence onto these platforms, but also endogenously they're able to build their own sort of governance system, which most recently the Oxford professor Willy Ledonvierte described as a cloud empire. And their own, the reason of using this particular term is because it insinuates a particular type of governance system, where if we use the rule of law analogy, here it would be more of a rule by law type of system. And so instead of, if we translate this into the context of these platforms, we would say that they are ruled by code, in the sense that they are operationalizing the particular power that they hold over the people who are using these platforms, and in some cases even beyond those who are actively using these platforms, to be able to exercise a particular type of will. And because of the fact that they themselves are not subject to the same constraints that they're placing on others, there's this idea of them instrumentalizing power. And so that's where we come into these notions of rule by law and rule by code, as opposed to rule of law and what I'll be talking about now, the rule of code. So if we transition from talking about these centralized platform operators to talking about decentralized Web3 platforms or networks, at least in an ideal sense, we end up coming to this discussion about the rule of code, because at least in principle, or at least the claim is that you would have no sovereign, or at least even if there is certain powerful players within this network, they are all subject to the same rules. So they are not able to assert themselves above others. And so they are able to at least meet this thin conception of the rule of law. And that's why there is this analogy drawn by some between the rule of code and the rule of law. Of course, and with this I will sort of end my point, and then if you have a follow-up question, I would go to that. But I think, of course, there can be criticisms about this on two levels. One is the fact that this is, as I just said, a thin conception of the rule of law, not one that is richer and thicker, as a lot of people would argue that the rule of law is, if we are talking about, for instance, human rights being a part of the rule of law, and whether the rule of code is able to encompass this. And at the other level, it's also about the clashes that can emerge between the rule of code and the rule of law. And I think here, this is also an interesting connection to what Patryk was just talking about with respect to certain principles that we are now know that are very important in a rule of law system and have known for a long time, might not always be translating very well into the context of, for instance, a decentralized network. So one example of this is about the notion of private property within these systems, and then the potential conflict between how important private property is vis-a-vis, for instance, immutability. So this sort of fundamental question emerged when we, for instance, look at the DAO attack, and look at which I think, as there was a discussion about this before, about DAOs before, maybe some of the people in this room are familiar with. But there, this sort of issue arises, and we can also apply this sort of rule of code and versus rule of law lens to look at that too.
So one of the themes that I think is important in the sort of discussion of rule of code or code as law is the idea that alternative legal or law-like systems are legitimated by a sort of choice to participate in them, right? So there's this idea of sort of the choice to participate in different legal orders, legitimating those as legal orders. And I have serious sort of questions about that, which I'd love to get your thoughts on, because in many ways I think that, for example, the choice to participate on a particular blockchain network, the choice to use Ethereum and accept the unchangeability of whatever transactions are validated by that network is a a thinner kind of community, right? A thinner kind of connection between people than the connection between people that underwrites the, for example, most, anyway, national legal orders, or even most, kind of, community-based legalistic establishments of norms, right? And so when we think about the ability of sort of new technologies to have a positive influence on existing systems of law, I think that is an important sort of factor to keep in mind. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that sort of the difference between being a participant in a legal order for reasons of birth, for reasons of citizenship, for reasons of participation in a community, versus, participation for reasons of having opted into a particular system of rules or using a particular network for. Is this sufficiently well-posed question for you to share your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely, and I think it relates to the second part of, the question you asked earlier with the example of Tang and creating these institutions that sort of, in a way, not only exert pressure, but also create an archetype of what could be, almost a prefigurative type of structure as well, especially when applied to traditional institutions. So I think this comes to the issue about what is the type of, let's say, issue or good that is in question. So, in a recent essay that Vitalik Buterin wrote, he distinguishes between these decisions which are sort of concave and convex, and which is quite an interesting way of looking at it, where he talks about particular decisions where you have public goods at stake, where it becomes even more important to have thicker notions of community. And as a consequence of this, you end up having to use different notions of governance than a purely, let's say, financial corporate notion of governance. And so, in that essay, he goes into this discussion about, looking at different types of DAOs used for different sorts of purposes, some being used for more public goods related purposes, basically, and others that are more contractual private goods related. And then thus, the type of governance that is appropriate also has to be modulated accordingly. So when we're talking about the more public goods oriented one, whether it's about financing public goods retroactively, whether we're talking about creating court systems like Kleros Online, he argues that we need to have a more political notion of governance that is able to, in a way, learn from the experience in, let's say, political theory and political science with trying to implement liberal democratic values, especially online, and then try to apply them in this case. So one example that I've been writing about a bit is the bicameral system that you might be familiar with in the work of Isabel Ferreras, where she talks about this, firstly in the context of a traditional corporation, but now increasingly also looking at it in the context of online platforms, is where instead of just having a board of directors, you also have a labor chamber. And so you have the investor chamber and the labor chamber in the board of directors as a way of grounding this particular organization into the needs of its most salient stakeholders. And so we can think about this as a particular example that could be relevant in the context of particular DAOs or particular types of blockchain networks as well. We can also think about one of the points that I think he asserts, which is really relevant, is about how when we talk about decentralization, it's not just a point that is made to create a type of decentralization theater or just to meet securities obligations or something, but it is to try to prevent certain types of harmful collusive behavior. Mm-hmm. And so there, again, having something that is more rooted in particular communities, especially when those are the ones that are most affected by it, is definitely a way of both maintaining the health of that particular organization, but also it gives us already an idea of what would be most appropriate in that context. And so we can think of, in some cases it might be that you have almost like a jury system where you have 13 people, an odd number, who get to decide on certain issues, for instance about oracles, or it can be something which is a citizens' assembly, and you have mini publics to try to vote on it. And so these are almost like judicial political hybrid organizations that are able to go beyond these superficial notions of community.
So I used to work for a federal court in the United States, and when I was doing that work, it often occurred to me that the work that the judge and his clerks are doing in the chambers is actually work that anyone could do. There's a public docket. There's public information about exactly what has gone into this legal case and what is the decision to be made. Anyone could look at that docket and decide what they think should happen next. And it's interesting to me, actually, that to imagine what would happen if more people were simply doing that, if more people were simply, trying to, rendering the kinds of decisions that judges make. And there are, in a way, the only difference between the position of people working in a judge's chambers and outsiders who have the same information is that sort of sense of loyalty to the institution, obligation to the institution to render the decision with a certain kind of attitude and with a certain kind of responsibility. But then there are very virtuous sorts of pressure that actually could be placed from the outside, for example, to work more quickly, right? I mean, you could, a dedicated team of lawyers could operate faster than a judge's chambers in most cases and do, high quality work. And it would be interesting to see what would happen if there were more networks, engaging in that kind of thing. And Patryk, to pivot back to your work, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how you're thinking about bringing, designing new kinds of institutions and using new kinds of technologies to repair the credibility of judicial systems and to perhaps do a better job balancing popular input and other imperatives in the construction of more legitimate systems.
Yeah, thanks for that question. But before, I would like to comment on what you have just said about the work of judges. Well, I think it's all about what is special in judicial adjudication. Is that judicial reasoning or legal reasoning, broadly speaking, is a way in which you can reach the same conclusion going through a very different paths of reasoning. And I think, and it is greatly presented on the European levels, in European courts. We, in the highest court of the European Union, we have an institution that is called Advocate General. This is a person, a lawyer that is responsible for draft an opinion about the case, to find possible reasonings, to come to a conclusion or two conclusions or three sometimes, and present the opinion to the public and to the court before the final judgment takes place. So I can see some parallels between what you and Morshed have described and how the highest judicial authority in the European Union works. Similarly, when we talk about the juries, there is also a deliberation that takes place, and there are various proposals how to approach a problem are presented, so on and so forth. But going back to your question, in our proposals, which are now in the form of recommendations to solve the ongoing rule of law crisis in Poland, we tend to employ or implement some new digital-like solutions. I will reveal some secret because it's the ongoing work, but we would like to show some recommendations about how judges should be appointed in Poland, and especially how a body that is tasked with judicial appointments, namely the National Council of the Judiciary, should be constructed. And we suggest that in response to what the Parliament did, it made a top-down decision to make the Parliament the body that elects the body tasked with judicial nominations. We would like to go back to the bottom-up approach, let judges elect their peers, their representatives in the Council of the Judiciary, but in a new reformed way, which is first, purely electronical elections. Judges are professionals, they use computers every day, and come on, it's a third decade of the 21st century, so I think every judge has at least some minor command of computer and internet and so on and so forth, but we also would like to propose a new voting system, which is called STV, Single Transferable Vote, which basically means that instead of crossing the candidate judges would like to see in the new Council of the Judiciary, they will rank the candidates from 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And there is a special algorithm that takes all those votes, all those ballots, and and as a result, it gives you the most representative 15 of judges. So I think this will be quite useful, especially when we see a huge polarization between members of the society, but also in the judiciary. So this is how this should be made. And also there is an ongoing project suggested by other non-governmental organizations to change the manner or how the Constitutional Tribunal operates. We have separate Supreme Court and Constitutional Tribunal, and this body was the first that was captured by the current majority, and they suggest a new case allocation system in order to promote legitimacy of that court, so restore the legitimacy of that court, in order to make the citizens, the public, aware and make them trust into the Constitutional Tribunal. They suggest a new digital case allocation system that will join new senior judges in the Constitutional Court with new judges of the Constitutional Court. That will bring more, that will connect, men and women, for example, in the judicial bench. So in order to promote a more tolerant and open way of dealing with cases, and at the same time to make sure and to guarantee that the cases are dealt with independently by judges. So these are the main proposals in which we see how we can implement some new technologies. Also, there is an ongoing discussion about what to do with lawmaking process, how to strengthen or how to make it more transparent. There are many issues going on in the parliamentary committees which are not as open as we expect they should be. So there are also some more advanced proposals how to deal with that and get rid of paperwork, which is very bureaucratic and makes everything slower, I think.
So just a quick follow-up, and then I'd love to open it to audience questions. But I wonder if you could comment on. It seems to me that given the sort of that the inherently democratic aspect of judicial work is the sort of transparency of the reasoning, in a way. It strikes me that one of the biggest obstacles to that, feature functioning as it should is the illegibility of the processes. So in other words, just the fact that there's so much information to process and there's a lot of technical legal background that is often needed to understand what happened at a court. It strikes me that the kind of transparency, the kind of, of public input that might be really useful would be systems of making it easier for anyone to understand exactly why a judge did what they did, exactly what their thinking was, so that, potentially poor reasoning would be more obvious, basically. I wonder if you can comment on the relationship between your proposals and that sort of thing.
Yeah, of course it depends on the jurisdiction, but there are already various ways to make public scrutiny of judicial reasoning more visible. For example, an organization can intervene in the proceedings and make its own oral or written submissions. There is an institution called Amicus Curiae, where also societies and organizations can show the court issues that are sometimes overlooked or more principled than the case they are dealing with. What I think here in Poland especially, we used to have a problem with transparency of judicial proceedings. For example, judgment of the Constitutional Tribunal, which is very fundamental and under which elements of EU law were deemed unconstitutional, this case has been decided on October 2021, but until now we can't see that there are no written motives of the case. So we know only 20 or 15 minutes of oral reasoning. So this is also a problem. So what we need is to teach judges that apart from being a branch of power, they are also accountable to the society or members of the society. And this culture of accountability should also encompass more transparency. This is not against judge to show how he or she works or the arguments on which the decision was made. It is a way to strengthen this judge in particular and his or her legal skills. And also to make the public aware what is happening in courts, how they should, what is happening in courts, why they are so important in a country governed by the rule of law, and so on and so forth. So I think we need some technical nudges, some technical solutions which are more popular in other countries in Europe and across the world. So only time matters.
Would love to have a couple quick questions if we've got just a little bit of time here, but if anyone has questions. I'm sure someone has a question. I'll sit here for a short while longer. In that case, Morshed, I wonder if you could comment briefly on, do you have thoughts on the sort of, the developments that you can foresee in the governance of in the governance of blockchain networks and other kinds of digital networks? Can you perhaps say a few words about how you foresee the kind of developments and those kinds of governance and the increasing sort of law-likeness of digital spaces and platforms? How do you think that will affect the way that people understand legitimacy and legality in conventional orders over the next few years? What do you sort of anticipate?
So I think I would have two sort of broad responses to that. One is emerging technologies. I've been using the example of blockchain. I think one interesting example is, and why this notion of illegality of blockchain became popular, is because not so much that it's not regulable, it's more about the question that it problematizes this distinction between what is legal and illegal. And this is a notion that legal philosophers like Hans Lindahl have been exploring in other contexts, and we can see here as well. So I think that's one aspect. So it sort of raises questions about what we value in a legal system in general. So we're already seeing this with, for instance, in England, where the Law Commission recently released a consultation paper arguing that digital assets should be considered as a third type of property outside of chosen action and chosen possession. And so that's a very, in a common law, an ancient common law system, to say that this is so fundamentally different that we need to introduce a third type of property is quite an interesting way of how we're seeing lawmaking evolve. The second is something you and I were talking about before, about what I call, and what Kleros and others have been discussing as well, as Schelling point justice. And so this idea of a Schelling point being a focal point where by default people come to a certain solution or a decision without communication between them. And I think this is a particular issue that we're going to see, because these Schelling points are now economically incentivized within these systems. And while this might be useful in particular contexts, they also hold particular dangers in terms of majoritarian decision making, because you think the majority is going to vote in a certain way. And because you're economically incentivized to vote along with the majority, you will try to do that rather than be most honest, perhaps, even if the system tries to make you honest. This conflict might be a problem, and then it can also allow for certain majoritarian biases to creep in. There's much more to say about this, but I think this is some of the issues that we're going to see.
Super. Well, thank you so much. We're at time, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you for being here. All right.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world, defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world
Changing the world
Changing the world
starts together
with us.